My people do not need promises. They need fields to feed their children and schools to shape their dreams. I am no hero, just a son of this soil working to give my nation the dignity it deserves.
On July 27, 2025, in the calm heart of Oslo, Norway, an announcement shook the global conversation on peace. Inside the halls of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, guardians of the planet's most prestigious honor, 5 names were revealed for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize shortlist. But one name instantly set the world alight with awe, debate, and hope: Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old interim president of Burkina Faso. This was far more than a nomination. It was a thunderclap, a challenge to the world's very understanding of leadership, governance, and peace in the modern era. Traoré, a soldier who seized power in a September 2020 military coup, was not the product of elite universities or polished diplomatic circles. He was a son of the soil, a leader whose idea of peace grew from the sweat of farmers, the dreams of children, and the resilience of a nation long pushed to the periphery. Hearing his name echo through Oslo's austere chamber sent ripples from the dusty streets of Ouagadougou to the power corridors of Paris, Washington, and beyond, forcing a global reckoning over what peace truly means in an age of division and uncertainty. The air in the Nobel Institute was electric in its minimalist elegance. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen midair, as the committee chair spoke Traoré's name. Diplomats traded glances, their murmurs carrying the weight of history. Here was a young African leader, not yet 40, from one of the world's poorest nations, standing alongside names forever linked with Mandela, Malala, and Martin Luther King Jr. His rise, from village boy to international symbol, embodied conviction over conformity, action over empty words, and hope over despair. This is the extraordinary story of Ibrahim Traoré, the farmer in uniform who turned war zones into farmland, despair into dignity, and a struggling nation into a beacon for the world. Born in 1988 in a small village in Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in the harsh Sahel, his early years were marked by unrelenting poverty. The sun beat down on cracked soil, electricity rarely came, and hunger was an unwelcome but constant guest. Yet within this crucible of deprivation, Traoré's spirit was tempered. His parents, subsistence farmers battling the unforgiving earth, taught him to revere the land and shoulder a deep sense of responsibility. "The earth is our mother," his mother would tell him, hands rough from years of toil. "Respect her and she will provide." Those words became the cornerstone of his character. In a country where schooling was a privilege, the military offered discipline, stability, and a way to serve. He joined not for power, but with the purpose of rescuing a nation slipping into disorder. By his early 30s, he had earned a reputation as a captain of unshakable integrity, respected by the men he led and trusted by the superiors who saw his resolve. But as his rank rose, so too did his awareness of a nation in freefall. Burkina Faso was bleeding, insurgents linked to Al-Qaeda, and ISIS ravaged the north and east, forcing over 2 million from their homes and leaving devastation in their wake. President Roch Christian Kabore's government appeared powerless, unable to halt the violence or confront the entrenched poverty, corruption, and foreign exploitation. By September 2022, the crisis had reached breaking point. Vast tracts of farmland lay in the grip of multinational corporations, siphoning profits abroad while locals starved. Foreign aid arrived with strings attached, offering no true relief. For Traoré and a cadre of young officers, the tipping point came on September 29, 2022. That day, they carried out a bloodless coup, removing Kabore and installing Traoré as interim president at just 34 years old. The world reacted with shock. Military takeovers were seen as relics of darker times. The African Union suspended Burkina Faso. Western capitals condemned the move, yet Traoré stood firm. In his first national address, wearing a simple military uniform, he spoke not of conquest but of renewal. "We did not come to rule," he declared, his voice steady as the Sahel wind. "We came to rebuild." With those plain, resonant words began a revolution unlike any other, not built on ideology or power plays, but on labor, unity, and truth. His vision, peace through self-reliance. In an era of flashy diplomacy and hollow promises, he revived the timeless virtues of work, sacrifice, and community. His battleground was not the insurgent-ravaged north, but the hunger gnawing at every village, the ignorance stunting young minds, and the despair-breaking spirits. His weapons were schools, clinics, and seeds. Within months of taking power, Traoré unleashed sweeping reforms that reshaped Burkina Faso and drew the world's attention. The insurgency was his first major challenge, but instead of fueling the violence, he chose radical reconciliation. More than 12,000 former militants, men and women once carrying the banners of terror, were reintegrated through community dialogues, vocational training, and resettlement programs. Traoré worked side by side with village elders, religious leaders, and local chiefs to create spaces where fighters could trade rifles for tools. Carpenters, farmers, and artisans emerged from the ruins of war, their hands now shaping rather than destroying. On May 4, 2025, he took it further, pardoning 1,100 former militants and enrolling them in the Farmers of Peace program. The UN hailed it as a global model for post-conflict recovery, turning battlefields along the Nadanon River into fertile farmland. Men who once manned checkpoints now operated irrigation pumps, their overalls stitched with Farmers of Peace. Terror attacks dropped 70%, and once fractured communities began to heal. In Kaya, a former militant named Musa Zongo spoke for, "Many, I fought because I had nothing. Traoré gave me a purpose, a field, a future, a home." But reconciliation carried risks. It required trust in a land scarred by betrayal, and courage in a region where vengeance was the norm. Yet Traoré's conviction never wavered. "These are not enemies," he said. "They are our brothers and sisters, lost to despair. Our duty is to guide them back to the light." His words resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, marked by similar wounds, the Farmers of Peace program became a symbol of second chances and peace born from unity, not division. Perhaps his most daring move was reclaiming 3.88 million hectares of farmland from foreign corporations that had dominated Burkina Faso's fertile plains for decades. In one bold stroke, he nationalized key agricultural holdings and redistributed them to smallholder farmers. "The land is not for sale," he declared, invoking the spirit of revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara. "It belongs to those who work it, who love it, who live by it." The decision rattled global markets. Farmers, now armed with land, seeds, and tools, began cultivating maize, sorghum, and millet, reviving rural economies. In Peseler, farmer Fatimata Ouedraogo described the transformation. "Before Traoré, we were tenants on our own land, begging for scraps. Now we feed ourselves, and our children sleep with full bellies." Markets brimmed with local produce, and food insecurity began to fade. The move also weakened Burkina Faso's reliance on foreign aid, sending a clear message: the nation would chart its own course. Land reclamation was more than economics, it was cultural and spiritual renewal. Farmers long sidelined now stood tall, reclaiming not only the soil but their dignity. In Gorom, market vendor Asa Diallo said, "When Traoré gave, US back the land, he gave us back our pride. We are no longer beggars, we are builders." The ripple effect was enormous. Local economies strengthened, rural communities thrived, and Burkina Faso began rewriting its story as a nation of resilience and self-reliance. Traoré's vision reached beyond his borders. The Sahel, plagued by desertification and climate change, became the canvas for his boldest environmental project, the Sahel Life Alliance. In partnership with Mali and Niger, Traoré spearheaded a plan to plant 800 million trees across the parched Sahel, turning barren land into lush green corridors. The initiative created thousands of jobs, restored ecosystems, and united nations once divided by scarcity and conflict. Environmentalists hailed it as a triumph of climate justice, proving that even the poorest regions could lead the fight against environmental collapse. Scientists marveled at how the reforestation slowed desertification and eased climate pressures. In Titawo, women who once walked miles for firewood now tended thriving saplings. "We are not just planting trees," Traoré said. "We are planting the seeds of a future where our children can breathe, where our land can live." The alliance became a global beacon of hope amid a deepening ecological crisis. The Sahel Life Alliance was also a diplomatic masterstroke. For decades, the Sahel had been a chessboard for foreign powers and corporate interests. Traoré's coalition transformed it into a shared mission, uniting Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Praise came from unexpected quarters. Even skeptical Western leaders acknowledged its impact. It's proof that global solutions can come from the most overlooked places, said a UN climate official. For Traoré, it was a matter of survival. "A nation without a healthy environment has no future. We are fighting for our lives." He knew peace required more than the absence of war. It demanded opportunity, dignity, and hope. His government cut wasteful bureaucracy by 60%, redirecting funds into education and healthcare. In just 18 months, Burkina Faso built 2,400 new schools and 700 health centers, stunning development experts worldwide. Schools rose in villages where children once studied under trees, lessons disrupted by rain and heat. Clinics brought medicine in. The program armed former fighters not with bullets, but with futures training, tools, and plots of fertile land. In villages across Burkina Faso, men and women who once shouldered rifles now leaned on hoes, channeling their strength into furrows of earth. Their sweat irrigated both the fields and the fragile trust between neighbors. The United Nations hailed the effort as a model for the world, with one senior official declaring, "Traoré has shown that peace is not won with weapons, but with opportunity." The ripple spread far beyond Burkina Faso in Mali and Niger. Similar movements took root, inspired by his success. In Djibo, a former militant named Issouf Compaoré summed up his transformation. "I fought because I had no hope. Traoré gave me land, purpose, and a family. Now I fight for peace." This was more than rehabilitation, it was a redefinition. It was a bold rewriting of what it meant to be a citizen, to belong, to build, to shape a nation's tomorrow. Each sapling in the Farmers of Peace fields bore a tag etched with liberté, travail, dignité. Traoré's vision distilled into 3 words. On July 1, 2025, during the Feast of All Saints, an unexpected voice joined the chorus of praise. Pope Leo XIV, a pontiff renowned for championing social justice, spoke from the Vatican with the gravity of centuries. "When I pray for peace," he said, "I see the face of a young soldier from Burkina Faso. He preaches not with laws or scripture, but with the work of his hands and the kindness in his heart. He has never walked the churches of Rome, yet he treats the poor as his cathedral." Then came the unprecedented Vatican nomination of Traoré for the Nobel Peace Prize, the first time in history the Holy See had endorsed a sitting African leader, let alone one who rose through a military coup. The papal endorsement reframed Traoré's journey as not just political, but a moral crusade, one that challenged the world's addiction to prestige and power. It shifted talk from lofty diplomacy to the hard, daily labor of peace. In Rome, the Pope's words stirred both reverence and debate, with scholars calling it a new definition of redemption for a man forged in conflict. Diplomats felt the tremor in Paris. President Anne Lucy Merritt, mindful of France's colonial shadow, offered careful praise. "We may not agree with his methods, but the results demand respect. He's writing Africa's story in deeds, not promises." In Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Janet R. Collins called his work a prompt to rethink peace in the 21st century. Brazil's President Luiz G. Costa was bolder. "Traoré is the new Sankara farmer in uniform, planting hope where others sow division." Even in Moscow, the Russian president lauded his pragmatism. "He builds not ideologies, but systems, food, schools, belief." The Vatican's gesture was more than symbolic, it was a summons to see leadership through a different lens. Traoré, a soldier who had never stepped into Europe's grand cathedrals, was now a moral figure on the world stage. His rise from regional reformer to global symbol forced the planet to question its notions of power, redemption, and peace in a century scarred by crisis. In Ouagadougou, the Nobel nomination sparked an eruption of joy. Tens of thousands filled the streets. Under homemade lanterns, chanting Ibrahim, Ibrahim. Vendors sold biscuit and roasted peanuts, while drums pounded rhythms older than the statues looming over the squares. Between two acacia trees, a hand-painted banner declared, "We no longer beg." The world now listens. Radios crackled with callers, shouting Sacra Victo, a cry of victory that carried through the night. Mothers wept openly, not in grief, but in relief, knowing their children now studied in the schools Traoré had built, safe from the gunfire of their past. Celebrations stretched far beyond Burkina Faso. In Niamey and Bamako, youth collectives projected his image onto public walls, chanting, "One Sahel, one dream." In Lagos, a student activist tweeted, "Traoré didn't chase Davos awards, he chased harvests. That's why this Nobel matters." In Johannesburg, students launched an art exhibit titled Fields of Peace, filled with paintings and poetry born from his agricultural revolution. Pan-African media called the nomination a reckoning, a rejection of old global orders, and a bold redefinition of Africa's role in the world. Along the banks of the Nadian River, former militants now wearing overalls stitched with farmers of peace worked shoulder to shoulder with locals, irrigating maize fields and rebuilding the trust that war had eroded. In Dori, a mother named Asa Sawadogo spoke for many. "My son used to fear the night. Now he sleeps peacefully, knowing there are schools to attend and fields to tend." The Nobel nod was more than recognition, it was validation of a people's resilience, proof that a nation once dismissed as a footnote could lead the way in defining peace. The celebrations morphed into a continental movement. In Accra, students held candlelit vigils discussing self-reliance. In Kinshasa, youth groups debated how his reforms could guide their own countries. On social media, #Nobel for Africa trended, as young Africans demanded honor for leaders who worked the land, not the lecture circuit. In Nairobi, a journalist wrote, "Traoré has shown us that peace is not a gift from the West, it is a harvest we grow ourselves." On July 28, 2025, a day after the Nobel announcement, the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood together in Ouagadougou for a historic press conference. Their joint statement framed the nomination not as one man's glory, but a continent's triumph. They unveiled the Joint Civil Command of the Sahelan institution to coordinate food security, resettlement, and rural healthcare. It was a declaration of independence. Africa would no longer be defined by the narratives of others, but by the hands of its own people. Neighboring states like Guinea, Chad, and Togo sent official congratulations, hinting that Traoré's model of self-reliance and regional solidarity might become a blueprint for African development. Inside the African Union, the nomination ignited fierce debate. Some delegates questioned whether governments born of coups should remain isolated. One commissioner, speaking anonymously, said, "We cannot judge leaders by how they rise to power, but by the roads, schools, and clinics they build." Calls grew for revising the AU's rapid response policies, with some arguing that Traoré's results demanded a new approach. Even in Europe and the US, diplomats began to acknowledge his growing legitimacy. While concerns about democratic norms persisted, more envoys voiced respect for Burkina Faso's sovereign path. Quietly, some global lenders reopened talks, with Ouagadougou a striking reversal from the months before, when Traoré had cut ties with the IMF. It was a tacit admission that his model rejecting foreign debt, nationalizing resources, and solving problems locally wasn't just viable, but transformative. His nomination became a mirror reflecting the world's contradictions. For too long, Africa had been a chessboard for foreign powers. Traoré flipped it into a canvas of self-determination. His rejection of IMF loans, his food sovereignty policies, and his ban on foreign mining were not just defiance, they were A quiet revolution, and the results spoke. Terror attacks down, farm yields up, clinics open, children fed. Across Burkina Faso, neighbors once divided by ethnicity now planted saplings side by side, each tagged with Liberté, Dignit. The Nobel Nod forced the world to ask uncomfortable questions. In an age of climate crisis, inequality, and unrest, is peace simply the absence of war, or is it the presence of justice, opportunity, and self-reliance? Traoré, the farmer in uniform, showed that true power lives in those who till the soil, teach the young, and heal the sick. His rise challenged the idea that leadership should be born of elite credentials or foreign approval. It was about service to the common good. Responses abroad were mixed. In France, President Merritt's careful praise hinted at a nation wrestling with its past. In the US, Secretary Collins spoke of rethinking peace-masking unease with his rejection of Western models. Brazil's President Costa was more direct, comparing him to Sankara, only to be corrected. "I'm no hero," Traoré told Costa. "I'm just a man who works the land." Costa later said, "That's when I knew he deserved the Nobel." In Moscow, the Russian president again praised his pragmatism. He builds not ideologies, but systems: food, education, hope. These weren't just compliments, they marked a shift in geopolitics. For decades, Africa was a battlefield. For foreign interests, Traoré was turning it into farmland, classrooms, and clinics. Even his critics now had to pay attention. His nomination was a pivot point, Africa speaking in its own voice, backed by its own actions. As December 10, 2025 approached, the world waited to see if he would become the first sitting African head of state to win the Nobel Peace Prize. If he won, he would also be the first leader honored despite rising through a military transition. A global emblem of practical peace, forged not in conference rooms but in fields, schools, and villages. Yet for many, Oslo's verdict was already secondary to the transformation he had unleashed. In Ouagadougou, nightfall could not quiet. The city, chants of Ibrahim Traoré pulsed through the streets, drums and lanterns lighting a nation reborn. Vendors served bissap and roasted peanuts, their joy as bright as the glow above. Between two acacias, a banner proclaimed, "We no longer beg, now the world comes to us." Across the Sahel, youth projected his speeches onto walls, their voices carrying the same dream. In Lagos, Accra, and Kinshasa, students held forums and vigils, their hashtags trending as they demanded recognition for a leader who worked